Hi, everyone, and welcome to the MCRUD webinar. We will begin in just a minute here.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for logging on. Like Louise said, we're going to get started here. I appreciate Louise helping me out. I'm not as familiar, so I'm going to get Louise kind of run this webinar for us. But many thanks goes out to Cassie and NABCA for helping us out. I will just say that NABCA and Cassie have been friends of me in Michigan for quite a few years. Known Cassie for quite a few years, going back to her days in Nebraska. So thank you. But Steve Schmidt and NABCA have helped us out in the past. They've shared some information about different control systems, how they're structured across the state, and they've been always available for technical assistance, and I really appreciate that. Steve wasn't able to come to Michigan, but we'll welcome him back if he can. But he sent another person from NABCA at a conference we did a couple of years ago. So thanks a lot for helping us out. And as far as certificates will be emailed out after the second part 2 webinar and evaluation. But certainly any questions you might have, put them in the chat box. I'll do my best to not lose track of them or see them. But I guess anything else we need to cover before I turn it to Cassie, Louise?
Well, I'll just go through the quick housekeeping. So welcome to the first MCRUD webinar, the Shaping Alcohol and Policy Environment, Past, Present, and Future, Part 1. Thank you all for joining today. And like Mike said, my name is Louise. We're joined today by Cassie Greason from the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association, or NABCA, and she'll present in just a minute. But first, I want to go through just a few housekeeping notes. So with that, there we go. So the first one, the arrow on the side of your screen, on the right-hand side of your screen, that'll open and close the control bar if anyone is having issues there. You'll also see the audio is set to play from your computer speakers by default. If you're having problems or would prefer to call in, just click the phone call under the audio tab and just follow the instructions. Also, you're automatically muted for this presentation. However, we welcome your engagement and questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them at any time in the question box in the control panel. Cassie, Mike, or myself will be happy to answer those at the end of the webinar. And lastly, once that webinar has concluded, we will open space up for Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, we just ask that you do the raise your hand button right there on the screen. And that way we can unmute you, and that then you can speak. So with that, Cassie, I'm going to transfer that over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Mike. You both did a lovely introduction. I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to Michiganders, and Michigan has a special place in my heart, I will tell you. My fiance's family is from Michigan, and I get to spend a lot of time there over the holidays in Muskegon and Grand Rapids. So this is just a real pleasure. And Mike and I have known each other for many, many years and have really appreciated all he's done in Michigan in alcohol prevention. So welcome to the 2-part webinar series that I hope you participate in both parts, because it will be a continuation thereafter. Shaping the alcohol policy environment, past, present, and future. I am going to stop sharing my webcam and come back when we ask a few questions and polls throughout. So just wanted to let you know that I'll be going away, but I'll be coming back shortly. All right, so I first want to start by saying earlier today I sent Mike this picture and said I'm channeling my inner Michigander, because like I mentioned, I have a special place in my heart for Michigan. So I just wanted to share with you that I just really appreciate the state and all that's been done on the prevention of alcohol and what's been done on alcohol policy. So with that, we're going to get and dive right in. Where are we going with this presentation? We're going to first go over the history and relevancy of alcohol regulation in part 1, and then we're going to talk about current alcohol consumption trends. And we're also, in part 2, going to look at effective alcohol policy and enforcement strategies, and also current alcohol policy regulatory trends. So part one is really going to focus on the history and consumption rates, and we're going to pivot in part two on May 14th to looking at effective alcohol policy and enforcement strategies and looking at those current trends in alcohol policy and regulatory trends. So we have our first poll, and Louise is going to help me with this polling question. So Louise, go ahead and do the poll. Here you'll see which sector best represents your role. Coalition leader / substance use prevention practitioner, law enforcement, regulatory authority, treatment provider, or other. This is really helpful for me to get a sense of who is out there listening to this webinar, and I will be telling you a little bit more about my background. So before I share a bit about myself, I'd like to know a little bit more about you.
All right, people are still going in, are clicking, so I'll give it just a few more seconds.
All right, thank you.
And I just shared 54% coalition leaders or substance misuse prevention practitioners, 5% law enforcement, 16% regulatory authority, 2% treatment provider, and 23% other.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louise. Appreciate the help. All righty. So now a little bit more about me and the organization that I represent. I wanted to share just a little bit about the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association. It's a nonprofit trade association established in 1938, shortly after the repeal of federal prohibition. Our governing board members are those states that are not only state government agencies, but are state agencies that are market participants, meaning they sell at least one beverage category at either wholesale or at retail. And while many trade associations are advocacy in nature, lobbying on behalf of their members, NABCA is not. However, to be clear, we are not a beverage alcohol industry organization either. But beyond our governing board members of control states like Michigan, we have a large tent of membership, including representatives from all sectors of the beverage alcohol industry, government agencies, prevention, public health organizations, law enforcement, and other public health safety organizations, as well as international members. We really work hard to strike the delicate balance between our many members by keeping our focus on being a repository of reputable data, science, and expertise on all topics related to beverage alcohol. So now a little bit more about me, now that I have a better sense of who you guys are. I am the Director of Public Policy for NABCA. I spend my days working to connect the fields of public health, prevention, and public safety to alcohol regulation, while also tracking trends and gathering data in those same areas. I started work in alcohol policy back in Nebraska, as Mike alluded to early on, which is where I am born and raised, a Nebraskan. And I worked for a statewide nonprofit organization leading county-level coalitions and youth groups in their prevention of underage drinking efforts. In 2013, I moved to Baltimore City to work at the Johns Hopkins University, the Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth. Some of you may have heard of it. It's CAMI by many folks' understanding. And while I was there, I worked closely with several large universities on their efforts to implement evidence-based interventions to address their excessive drinking rates among their students, specifically working on responsible beverage service requirements and local social host ordinances. And I also volunteer my time in my spare time, lending my expertise in community organizing and alcohol policy for the Baltimore Good Neighbors Coalition, which works to implement evidence-based strategies to prevent alcohol outlet-related violence in Baltimore. Now, I've since moved to Virginia, but I continue to work with the Baltimore Coalition. And I encourage all of you, if you take off your day job hat and get an opportunity to lend your expertise, it's a pretty rewarding opportunity. All right, so enough about me and the organization. We're going to move on to the history of alcohol regulation, and hopefully you'll gather some new information that perhaps you didn't know before. So often the best predictor of the future is to look at the past, and the same is true for alcohol regulation. So looking back at the historical perspective of alcohol regulation and where we've been, I'm sure you've heard a version of prohibition, the prohibition story, but my hope is that through this time together, we're able to expand your knowledge of this moment in history that continues to be a foundational aspect of alcohol regulation. So let's start in 1750, and the first wave of immigrants to this country were of European descent and brought their heavy drinking culture. Alcohol was considered healthy and was nearly twice as high in consumption as it is today, according to historians. To illustrate just how important alcohol was to our culture and our history, workers were given breaks at 11 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon for alcohol consumption, mostly liquor at the time. Part of this was because many other products weren't safe to drink. Even milk could be unsafe if the cows ate milkweed, a toxin that is poisonous to humans. In short, our alcohol ancestors drank quite a bit. In the early days, alcohol consumption was an important commodity to our economy. When farmers in Appalachia had a surplus of corn and our infrastructure for transportation was less developed, there was no good way to transport the corn. The solution was to turn the corn into whiskey, and it was far easier to transport to the heavy drinking population in the East. It became somewhat of a patriotic thing to drink whiskey before, but then people drank rum and it was an import. Now, looking back at the 1800s to the 1900s, another wave of immigrants brought beer and their beer-making skills. These immigrants were from Germanic countries such as Germany and Austria. By the 1900s, they dominated the alcohol market. They introduced the country to what's known as the saloon system, where beer manufacturers also own saloons in virtually every little community. The idea of manufacturers owning saloons is known as a tied house, or as we refer to it today, vertical integration. Nearly 70% of saloons were owned and controlled by large out-of-state manufacturers. They used very aggressive sales techniques to edge out their competition. They were often placed by factories so men could go there directly after work, and often men pledged their paychecks to the saloon, leaving little resources for the family. These conditions created heavy drinking and public order problems. During this time, they had licensing mechanisms, but mostly to capture revenue. There was little alcohol regulation happening. So states really struggled to find an answer to the alcohol problem. And in 1910, alcohol really was seen as a black and white issue. Either you allowed it or not. No thought was given to regulation. Largely out of the public order problems, the Anti-Saloon League gained popularity and power through skillful lobbying efforts. In 1917, when the U.S. entered World War I, there was an anti-German sentiment. And then in 1919, the prohibition was instituted by way of the 18th Amendment. 13 years later, a short 13 years later, although some probably felt it was very long, federal prohibition ended in 1933. So I like to tell the good and the bad story of prohibition. The good is that it did help eliminate the public order problems that were pretty rampant. During its early years, it did reduce consumption, at least what we know to be true from the records where we have data. But unfortunately, the bad is that national organized crime emerged, producing an illegal market. Illegal retail outlets known as speakeasies also grew out of this time, where prostitution and other seedy behavior flourished, and enforcement was weak and virtually non-existent. So what resulted was the end of federal prohibition and ultimately giving the states the right to regulate the sale of the product. One of the biggest, another piece I like to point out about prohibition is that we treated this country as though we were of one mindset on alcohol policy, and that could not be further from the truth. And you see that reflected in our state laws today. A lot of variety in how our states are structured in terms of alcohol regulation. With the passage of the 21st Amendment, which again gave the states the primary responsibility of alcohol regulation and tax collection, we began to start experimenting. It's a natural experiment that still exists today to try different opportunities around alcohol regulation. So they had the problem, however, it was these states came out of 13 years of federal prohibition. They had little experience in this area. And it was the John D. Rockefeller who financed a study with two researchers, Fosdick and Scott, and they wrote Toward Liquor Control, which is a seminal piece of research and they interviewed over 400 leaders from all walks of American life to better understand what path forward should states take when looking at how they should structure alcohol regulation and also how they should mitigate the harms that they saw prior to federal prohibition. So out of Toward Liquor Control, it really created a blueprint for state regulatory systems. And there were a couple big takeaways. The first was reduce aggressive sales tactics. So reducing these sales tactics such as incentives to consume in high volume, that was a primary goal for state regulation. Preventing that vertical integration, the Tide House Saloon that we talked about earlier, where they can dominate the marketplace. Restrict hours, days, and location of sale to curtail public order issues. Place more limits on high ABV products as well. There are still exists today where the structure of our taxes, there are higher tax rate for spirits than there is for beer and wine. There are typically fewer locations that sell spirits, and control jurisdictions like Michigan often oversee the sale of spirits. But another big takeaway from Toward Liquor Control was the idea of two forms of alcohol regulation. That states were largely through the Fosdick and Scott Toward Liquor Control report encouraged to adopt a control system because it took out the motive for profit, is how they described it. But they also recognized that states were likely going to pursue the license structure. And these two systems emerged out of this report, and there is a big the piece that distinguishes one from the other is that under the control model, the state owns part of the alcohol business, usually the wholesale or retail operations. All control jurisdictions wholesale spirits. Some have wine and beer, while others have state-run stores selling beverage alcohol. Now, licensed jurisdictions in the license system, they are largely driven and distributed, and the product is sold by the private sector. These are across the country. There are 18 jurisdictions that have the control model. So again, Fosdick and Scott's prediction that the majority of states would go the license route was accurate, but still a quarter of the U.S. States are in nearly a quarter are under the control model, and one county in Maryland has the control model. Where you see the lighter gray states, these are municipalities that have adopted the control model. I want to spend a minute just to highlight, where does the money go? And it really is a often misunderstood area, and I want to unpack it a little bit while I have you on the phone here, because the benefit of the control model is that because the state sells the product, they're in the market, they're a market participant, the revenues from these sales go back into the state budget for essential services, while in a licensed jurisdiction, these revenues go to the private sector. So looking toward Michigan, in the fiscal year 2018 financial report, anyone can look up this information, you can see that $230 million went into the general fund, and you have also about $6 million that went toward licensing and enforcement. $500,000 went to alcoholism prevention programs, and about 55% of the retail license fee, so over $7 million, went to local government. And those are monies that would otherwise have gone elsewhere. And so to have that go back into the state infrastructure to support monitoring and compliance of the licensee community to maintain a healthy marketplace is really something notable and important to remember about the control model. But regardless of whether you're in a control jurisdiction or a licensed jurisdiction, there are a lot of similarities between the two of them. So one, they license everyone to sell the product. There is a license structure of some sort, or some states refer to it as a permit. They enforce laws to reduce underage and excessive drinking. They also regulate days, hours of sale, locations of premises, and density of outlets. And they require products to flow through a closed 3-tier system. And I want to spend just a little bit of time unpacking the 3-tier system. And I like to quote our General Counsel, Neil Inslee, on this one, because he often will say, you know, we're a victim of our own success with the 3-tier system. It operates in the background, provides us a lot of protection and public health and safety, and we don't even know that it's there. And this really harkens back to Fosdick and Scott's point about avoiding vertical integration. When you think of the 3-tier system, you have the producer, the wholesaler, and the retailer. And they're independent, closed systems. And again, it's to prevent that marketplace domination that we saw prior to Prohibition. And when you look at the 3-tier system, each one of these tiers has a specific role to play. And I want to narrow in on the wholesale tier, the middle tier. And I kind of like to describe the 3-tier as like an hourglass, because you have the producers and then you narrow in at the wholesale level and you go back out to the retail level. And the point here is at the wholesale level, that is where we do our tax collection. And it's where we're able to do quality controls. And it's really important that we have the ability to protect consumers and make sure we can get tainted products off the market. And it's really important that we're able to collect taxes when it's related to alcohol. So when you think about some headlines we've seen over the last year or so, where other countries have had tainted products ultimately kill people, this is a potential liability and risk with this product. But the wholesale tier in our country, the 3-tier system, has really helped to ensure that we have near 100% tax collection, and we have an ability to track down any type of tainted product that gets into the market, again, for consumer protections. So this is a foundational element to alcohol regulation that is often not even known about, but critical to the safety of the market. Looking toward what are some of the pillars of alcohol regulation, and it's, I think, an important reminder that regulation exists first and foremost to protect public health and safety, and then to ensure efficient tax and revenue collection. Very important. I think as we hear the debate around cannabis, that's a big topic that we hear, and certainly that would have been the case back when this debate was happening around should we allow alcohol sales or not. Tax collection is a really important element to the structure of alcohol regulation, and eliminating unfair and illegal marketing practices. Again, as we saw prior to Prohibition, that's an important focus. And finally, balancing the many interests of all the stakeholders, whether it be within the industry itself, and also balancing those public health and safety considerations. Both aspects critically important, and the regulatory authority really has to balance those things. So we're up for our next poll. Louise is going to help me out with that. So if you would just take a moment to talk to me a little bit about how many times have you attended an administrative hearing with your alcohol regulatory authority, which of course in Michigan is the Michigan Liquor Control Commission. Just take a moment. The poll is open, I can see. And Louise, thank you for helping me out with that.
We'll give it just a few more seconds.
All right.
So 63% said never, 20% once or twice, 16% several times, and 2% I attend all the hearings.
Okay. Now, I don't want to call Mike on the carpet or anything, but I do know he's a frequent flyer at the Michigan Liquor Control Commission hearings and engages quite a bit. And so I'm sure he would welcome additional friends on that front. And I believe we have a commissioner who has joined us. And so I don't know if you're able to, Louise, open the floor for the commissioner to speak, but I would certainly welcome the opportunity for her to share the opportunities in which the public can engage with the Liquor Control Commission. Is Commissioner Geraldine Lasher on, and are we able to give her the mic?
She is on, I believe.
Let me see if we can get her.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yeah, there you go.
You are.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate being able to be on this today. There's a lot of opportunities for folks to connect, and we really encourage you to do so through whether attending some of the hearings. Right now, while we're in the work from home status, we're doing those telephonically. So we've got the number and the passcode posted on the website, so people are always encouraged to call in. Also, you know, any of the commissioners or the business manager, certainly we're always happy to also discuss one-on-one. So if you have anything that you are interested in bringing to the attention of the commission, or if there's a specific topic or area you'd like to engage us with, we are always open to that opportunity.
Just a quick question. And on the, I know that due to COVID, there's a hearing on March 19th, the semi-annual hearings. I'm assuming it's probably hasn't been rescheduled, but can you talk about the semi-annual hearings a little bit?
Absolutely, we do those twice a year. And you're right, with the situation that happened, we were unable to do the March 19th meeting. I don't believe we have a new date for that yet. But as a part of that, it's really our opportunity to make sure that people, we do one in Lansing and one in Southeast Michigan. We were scheduled in Southfield for the last one, to come and be able to connect with, if you have an issue to bring before the commission. That's really the purpose of the semi-annual meeting. We want to hear from all different constituencies. So that those are at least two times a year. But again, any of our meetings, all of our commission meetings are open to the public, and we take public comment at each of them. So you don't have to wait just for the semi-annual meeting in order to do that. But that is a very specific, those are very specific meetings intended to really engage with people and hear directly from them on alcohol policy issues.
Thank you, Commissioner. I really appreciate you kind of chiming in and adding to the webinar, because that just puts some context into it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty. So this is a good time to talk about the different branches of government and the control that different branches of government have in relation to alcohol regulatory changes. And as the Commissioner just noted, certainly the executive under the executive branch, there's certainly changes that are happening both with at the Michigan liquor control level, but also, you know, certainly we're seeing this through governor's executive orders. COVID has put a fine point on that in terms of their ability to provide additional opportunities for the industry to be able to pivot to address some of these, you know, stay-at-home orders and still try to stay afloat. The legislature, I think, is also very important for prevention and public health to be, just as the Commissioner opened up the door to say, you should be talking to us, you should also be educating your policymakers, both at the state and your local level, about alcohol related harms and the data and the things that you know to be true, because you shouldn't make an assumption that folks know this information, and it helps regulatory entities as well as policymakers understand all aspects of this issue. So encouraging you to have an open dialogue, and education is really important. And I know there's a lot of fear out there in relation to lobbying, but you can do a lot with education before you overstep into the lobbying arena. So just keep that in mind, that dialogue is really important to share your knowledge, your expertise from a public health and prevention standpoint. And I really encourage you to do so, because again, that helps balance the conversation. So when you look at the legislative branch, you know, they're typically creating the laws and regulations, and at the executive branch, at the Michigan Liquor Control level, they're typically writing rules and regs to within the intent of the legislature to see those laws through. And at the judicial level, they're interpreting the meaning of those laws. And we have seen a lot of changes happen on alcohol regulation through the judicial branch of late. In fact, there was just a Michigan case related to whether or not to allow it and permit out-of-state retailers to direct ship into Michigan. And ultimately, the court ruled that to protect public health and safety, they were not going to permit that kind of activity. So the judicial branch has a very significant role in shaping alcohol regulation as well. So alcohol regulation impacts all the 4 P's of marketing: promotion, place, price, and product. And it's important to kind of put it in the context of the 4 P's, because it just crystallizes it. We think of our communities in this way, and alcohol regulation has the opportunity to impact on all fronts here. I often, we talked about the 21st Amendment creating sort of a tapestry of laws and structures around alcohol regulation, but this to me really contextualizes it. Where is the alcohol regulatory responsibility under the executive branch across the country? And you can see quite a variety, but mostly they fall in sort of 4 buckets. Either they're in the majority of states have it under the finance commerce section of the executive branch, and that largely follows the federal model, where the primary authority for alcohol regulation at the federal level is with the Tax and Trade Bureau. Clearly, an emphasis on collecting the taxes. Then there are about 16 states that are standalone, meaning they're directly under the governor. And the next category is public safety and consumer protection. And then finally, where Michigan is, which is under licensing, regulation, and attorney general. I think that's just kind of important to understand sort of where things are housed across the country and where that is in Michigan. And to just take a closer look at your border states, you have states, when you compare it to Michigan, like Michigan, Ohio, we have a control state, for example, in Ohio, right up against Michigan. But like Michigan, Ohio and Wisconsin are within larger departments. So they're not, they are under the government, and they're a division of another department. Also, like Michigan, Ohio has a more centralized system for licensing and enforcement authority, while Wisconsin and Indiana allow licensing at the local level. And in Wisconsin, I think it's important to note that they have primary enforcement of the license holder community is occurring through local police. I share this slide to illustrate how varied alcohol regulatory structures are regionally, as a reflection of sort of that natural experiment I alluded to earlier, where we're still embarking on this across the country nearly 100 years later post-federal prohibition. Remember, as a country, we feel really differently about alcohol consumption and sales and regulation, and this is largely driven by our state's culture and norms. So it's certainly reflective in this slide as we look at the states bordering Michigan. Important, very, very important note, I think, to turn to alcohol enforcement. This is an area that is so critically important and often overlooked, quite frankly. First, what do I mean when I say alcohol law enforcement? You might automatically think of underage compliance checks, underage decoy operations. Perhaps you help facilitate those in your own community with your coalition grant dollars. But alcohol enforcement goes well beyond these operations to prevent illegal underage sales. It's about doing background checks for license applicants to ensure they meet the criteria for the privilege to hold a liquor license in the state. It's about regular inspections to ensure a license holder is operating within the scope of what their license type permits. It's about making sure they're not violating trade practices, which is largely dealt with at the federal level with the Tax and Trade Bureau. It can be about ensuring a license holder is adhering to the zoning provisions that may require certain lighting or performance standards, or restrict where a license can be placed For example, in Baltimore City, you can't have a liquor store in a residential zone. And of course, the issues surrounding nuisance bars often is something that there has to be a high degree of coordination between the regulatory authority and local law enforcement. Understanding where your alcohol enforcement is housed and who has authority over the alcohol beverage laws is a critically important aspect to prevention work. However, alcohol enforcement resources are dwindling. In 2005, NHTSA had a report on the role of ABC enforcement, and this was documented pretty clearly. And for many states, the budget has continued to decrease while licensing has expanded. Prevention and public health have a role to make sure policymakers, decision makers understand the importance of enforcement's role in ensuring a safe and healthy alcohol marketplace to maintain compliance. Additionally, the coordination, as I mentioned, even as I talked about nuisance bars, the coordination between various levels of alcohol enforcement is really important, and making sure systems talk to one another, that law enforcement has that assistance between each other, to monitor the activities in and outside licensed establishments. And finally, data collection. You are very fortunate as in Michigan. You have an alcohol epidemiologist. There are 5 alcohol epidemiologists across the country, and Michigan is one of the states that has that. Now, this is a person who has particular expertise to help map alcohol outlets in relation to harms, to tell a story about what is happening in relation to your alcohol outlet density. But it's really important that there's good data collection of enforcement operations. And if these data are not available, it makes it very difficult for epidemiologists to illustrate the demand on law enforcement resources, or to understand the picture of what might be occurring out in the licensed alcohol outlet environment. This data is the linchpin to providing the rational nexus or the legal basis for the regulations you have on the books. If this data isn't available, there is a risk of losing of jeopardizing the ability to provide that rational and legal basis for why you have the regulations on your books. So this data collection, I cannot illustrate it enough how important it is. And I really encourage you as prevention and public health to be thinking about how are you collecting data in your state, and how does law enforcement collect data in your state, and how is that shared with not only the Michigan Liquor Control Commission, but how is that shared with and available to the alcohol epidemiologist to be able to paint the picture of what's happening with alcohol outlets in the state. So now we're going to turn our attention to consumption trends. And as we do that, I want to start off with another poll so that I can get a sense of where we're starting at. And the question is, what is the definition of excessive drinking? What is the definition of excessive drinking? So Louise is going to open the poll. So please take a moment. And, when you're doing webinars, sometimes this is like the best you can get for interaction and engagement. So please participate in the poll. It is really helpful to give me a sense of where we're starting in the knowledge you have. So what is the definition of excessive drinking?
All right, I'll give people just a few more seconds. I know some people are having problems with the polls, so I apologize for that. But 74% say all of the above.
Well, I have to say, this is a knowledgeable crowd, and I am quite pleased with that. So let me just pivot here, and I'm going to stop sharing my my webcam, and we'll move right into, you guys are spot on. So kudos for knowing your stuff. Yes, it is all of the above. You are correct, and it does often surprise people that excessive alcohol use is broadly defined by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It incorporates binge drinking. For women, that's 4 or more drinks. For men, it's 5 or more drinks. It includes heavy drinking, alcohol use by pregnant women, and of course, underage drinking, those under the legal age of 21. That is the definition by CDC about excessive alcohol consumption. And I like to share this because then we're all starting from the same place as we move through the slides. So let's take a look at what does excessive drinking look like in Michigan. This is according to the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey or system, which is through CDC. And this is current binge drinking and heavy drinking. And these are the latest data that I'm aware of since 2017. So it just gives you a snapshot of the deeper the blue, the more excessive drinking you have. And this is by county. And then the lighter the blue, the lower the rate of excessive drinking. And of course, on the left-hand side, you can see the ranges. But I wanted to show that just to share, and perhaps if you know your state really well, none of this is surprising, perhaps. But I did want to give you a picture of what's going on in Michigan. So CDC also has recently started trying to frame the conversation around excessive drinking that this is not an alcohol-dependent issue. 9 out of 10 excessive drinkers are not alcohol dependent. They do not meet the diagnostic criteria for having an alcohol use disorder. 9 out of 10 people. We have to do a good job of making sure people understand the reality. This is a myth that it's all about alcohol dependence. Often drives both prevention efforts and policy responses. So it's important to make sure we're basing these kind of decisions off of the facts. And here are the facts. About 95% of the 88,000 annual alcohol attributable deaths in the U.S. involve adults 21 years and older. So if efforts are only focusing on underage drinking, we're missing a large part of the population to impact alcohol-related harm. And I can tell you this is a national perspective, but when you drill down to your state, which your alcohol epidemiologist can help you do, it often reflects a similar percentage. So when we look at adults, how are they drinking? Well, if you look at past 30-day use, 50% of adults did not drink. But for the other 50% who did, 2 in 3 are drinking in excess, above the moderate guidelines. Now, who is defining moderate levels of consumption? That's the U.S. dietary guidelines, believe it or not, which they're in the midst of being rewritten every 5 years, and that process is happening right now. So for men, it's up to 2 drinks a day, not more than 14 per week. And for women, up to 1 drink a day, not more than 7 per week. Now, keep in mind, these are standard drinks. So 2 in 3 adults are exceeding these guidelines. This is really important information that should be shaping your prevention work. This is also another angle, as again, all CDC data here, and they are looking at the difference between prevalence, so how many times do people binge drink in the past month, versus intensity on the right side, so total binge drinks per binge drinker. So, you know, in Michigan, you're higher on the scale. The deeper the red, the more drinking that's happening. But take Idaho, for example. You can see on the left-hand side, their prevalence rates are pretty low. They have a lighter, paler pink. But on the right side, intensity of drinking is so when people are binging, they're binging with great intensity in Idaho, just as an example to illustrate how this slide is playing out. But the trends in alcohol use just across the board are consumption is going up across all age groups, across all genders, but most prominently spiking in for women, older adults, racial and ethnic minorities, and socioeconomically disadvantaged. And emergency room visits related to alcohol have risen 62% since 2006 to 2014, and alcohol-related deaths have doubled since 1999. Something's happening here with consumption and harms. And again, this is an opportunity for prevention and public health to raise awareness about these trends. And let's not forget the opioid crisis, which there's so much focus there, as there should be. As one epidemiologist told me once, you know, one reason why we are focusing on opioids so much is that we're hemorrhaging tragic deaths, and alcohol is more of a trickle. over time. And I hear her in what she's saying, but the important thing is there is an alcohol story in the opioid crisis. And that is the fact that more than half of the 4.2 million people who misuse prescription opioids in the US also binge drink. That's a really important aspect. And typically in our states, money for prevention comes in silos. We have money for opioids, we have money for alcohol, we have money for tobacco prevention, and we work in those silos. And there's polysubstance use happening across the country, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this call, but ultimately there is an alcohol story to tell in the opioid story, and I encourage you to make that connection. Certainly CDC is really trying to help people understand that. So I want to just do and I can tell it looks like the slide is kind of coming off the chart here, so sorry about that. But I want to make sure that you know about part 2 of what's going to come, the Shaping the Alcohol Policy Environment part 2, which is May 14th, 1:30 to 2:30 Eastern. So I'm just going to give a little prelude to what that's going to look like, and then we're going to turn it over for questions. So with that, as I noted on the front end of the presentation, we're going to look at policies that work and current trends in alcohol. We've already looked at alcohol consumption. We're going to look to what is happening within the alcohol marketplace and also what's happening with alcohol regulation and alcohol policies over time. And so we're going to look to CDC, as we have been throughout this presentation, because they've been doing a lot of work in this area around alcohol policy. They've pulled together expert panels, they've done systematic reviews, they've looked at the effectiveness, and then they've rolled out recommendations with this expert panel of independent public health and prevention experts. So we're going to take a peek at that data, not even data, but those recommendations. We're going to look at some newer research that's been out from Dr. Tim Namey from Boston University that NIAAA, National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, is funded to look at alcohol control policies, giving every state a score and looking at outcomes, impaired driving, underage drinking, adult binge drinking, to see is there a correlation between the safeguards that a state may have in place and these outcomes. And we're going to look at some drivers of change. There are drivers changing the marketplace, including economic concerns for small and local producers, emerging technologies and the conveniences, the one-stop shop business model that really consumers are demanding. And so we're going to take a peek at some of these things that are driving that. We're going to look at direct to consumer. Get the door, it's the liquor store. We have, this is data from the STOP Act report to Congress as of 2018. We're going to look at direct shipping and where it's permitted. And we have even more data to look at by what beverage product is permitted for direct shipping. And what are law enforcement doing in this new market to address that? Home delivery and third-party delivery drivers, and what are we seeing in that? It's a little bit of a different picture from direct shipping. Fewer states are permitting home delivery. Just note, though, this data is from 2017, so this is a fast area of policy change, and certainly COVID has expedited that, at least temporarily. And speaking of COVID, I just want to make a quick plug for we've created a number of interactive dashboards tracking operational changes for restaurants, bars, and off-premise locations by state, so you can see how does Michigan look in comparison to its neighbor states and across the country. This is, like I mentioned, a fast-moving area of policy changes, and we thought, for our members, we want to make sure we unpack all of this and provide a useful tool. So I encourage you to go to nabca.org, nabca.org, to get these resources. They're all free. Please utilize them. We pulled them together for a reason. In addition, you can find your state-specific Michigan Liquor Control Commission's COVID resource page too, because certainly the alcohol regulatory authorities have had to put out additional, not recommendations, but guidance for the licensee community as they navigate this uncharted territory. And with that, I thank you, and I open it up for questions. I think we have close to 10 minutes for questions. So Louise and Mike, I pass it back to you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very
Thank-
much, Cassie. Yes,
There were a few.
go ahead, Louise.
Sorry, there were a few questions, Cassie, on the in the questions box. The first one from Barry: can we get the excessive drinking information at a county or local level through Pat? And it might be a question more for Pat, if he wants to type that into the chat box for everyone.
Well, the data that I did provide from, that was the county health rankings as of 2017, the behavioral health risk survey information I provided. Certainly Pat does have access to that. I can answer for him. But that data is available, and I'm sure Mike and Louise are going to be making this PowerPoint available to everybody. But if you go to countyhealthrankings.org, it's a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded project. You can get your state and county level data for both impaired driving and excessive drinking for adults.
Thank you. And the next one from Ariel: why is there so much back and forth reporting on what pregnant women can have as far as drinking alcohol?
Well, I can't speak for CDC, but I will say, and I don't know what you mean by back and forth, whether the guidelines have changed or if that's what you're alluding to, but I do know that when CDC made some recommendations around pregnant women and consumption, they did receive a little bit of backlash for how they made that recommendation. I can't speak for CDC, but I'm aware of that. But I can't explain why the back and forth may have happened. So sorry, perhaps others on the call would have more guidance on that.
All right, and people are also welcome to raise their hand, and I'll either Mike or I will unmute you. But the next question is from Mary Ann, John Cronick, sorry. With data on combining marijuana and alcohol consumption, what is the status of restrictions regarding serving, selling, using alcohol and marijuana or THC in the same location?
Yeah, so my area of expertise is not tracking cannabis sales and the interplay between cannabis being sold at retail locations. So I don't think I'm probably the best person to speak to that. Certainly Mike or Louise, if you guys have more input on these fronts, you absolutely can feel free to chime in.
I'll make a comment. I don't know, maybe somebody in liquor control knows, but I know that Laura was looking at these rules around, I think there's some language that would have allowed people selling cannabis, people that are selling alcohol could sell cannabis. They're taking some public comment on that issue, and some of our public health groups weighed in saying, it's probably not a good thing, but I haven't heard any updates. So I don't know if anybody else from Lara has anything about that.
Mike, this is Geraldine. They did modify the rules based on some of that comment. I think we still want to examine that a little bit more. It basically took the alcohol reference out. I think we at the commission were a little more comfortable if it was very explicit in the rule prohibiting consumption at or that being provided at the same location. So I think that's something that we're going to continue. We have had very good discussions, and we'll continue to have discussions with the marijuana regulatory agency within Lara as well.
Thanks.
And the next question is from Kurt. Can you speak more about the position of alcohol epidemiologists? What is their role? Where are they housed? How and who do they communicate with? And are they available as a resource? And I'm wondering if Pat wants to answer. I don't want to put him on the spot.
Oh, put him on the spot.
I'll unmute you.
He can say he doesn't have a comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, so I'm here. So can you repeat that question? I know there was about 3 or 4 questions within that one question.
Yes. Can you speak more about the position of alcohol epidemiologist? What is their role? Where are they housed? How and who do they communicate with? And are they available as a resource?
Okay, I'm going to start from the back end of that. Yes, I'm here as a resource for the entire state. I work with Mike quite a bit, and Louise as well, of course. on various statewide issues. Work with a lot of other local coalitions that Mike is involved with. We do collaborative research together. I can essentially work with anyone across the state that is interested in alcohol-related issues. I'm here to help in any way that I can. I have a lot of great data contacts if you want to look at specific alcohol-related data. I, of course, don't own all of the data, but I can certainly get just about anything alcohol-related that you can think of for the most part. If you want to get really granular and small with the data, it's less likely that I will be able to release it because the numbers are probably smaller or too small for me to release. But that being said, I am definitely here to help. My position is supported through the CDC. Like Cassie said, there are 5 of us on this one particular alcohol grant coming out of the CDC. So, I work with the CDC very closely. All of my work that I publish on my website and in other areas goes through the CDC and is approved by them first. So I'm about as close to a CDC employee as you could get without being a CDC employee, because none of my work is approved and posted without their knowledge or their okay. So that being said, I can utilize them probably much more effectively than a lot of other folks who have CDC grants, because the alcohol program is quite small, and I'm very close with the program there, and I work very closely with them on a basically regular daily basis. So if there's really high level questions or high level research that somebody wants to look into, you can pretty much rely on me to help, and the CDC as well. So that's good to know. Was there anything I missed in there, Luis?
I think that was great. That was everything. Thank you.
And if you want like more information and whatnot, Mike usually sends out the different things that I publish and whatnot. I don't know if you've seen some of my fact sheets or briefs. We've got some bills in the works that I've been tracking. I've written policy briefs on and stuff. So if you want a link to our site, we can talk offline later, or I can post it in the chat as well.
Just one more, just want to add to that for a quick second. So yes, we are very fortunate to have Pat, again, 1 of 5, but we also have a lot of expertise in Michigan. And so, McCrud is building a stronger relationship all the time with our colleagues over at Michigan State. And we got Dr. Deborah Verholden, who, Cassie, you may have worked with her in your Baltimore work, but they've done a lot of work on outlet density in the city of Baltimore. But Dr. Verholden's presented in past McCrud meetings, and her colleagues there, Dr. Maika Smart and Dr. Rick Sadler. Again, we're doing some stuff with looking at Kalamazoo and outlet density. And just as an example, Pat and I are in the very early discussions looking at health disparities, maybe looking at a webinar or some kind of presentation down the road, because Pat brought in a health disparities epidemiologist. So again, but absolutely, Pat's here for a resource. We got a lot of resources in Michigan, so we just need to access them. Okay, one more question maybe, Louise?
Yes, that sounds good. I just put the website into the chat box for everyone.
Thanks.
The last questions from Kathy. What cost benefit analysis models do state and local governments use before adopting new regulations or policies? And where can I find more information on this topic?
Well, I cannot speak to what Michigan does specifically because I'm not familiar. So it would be, I would welcome others who are, know the Michigan specific analyses if there are some that happen. But I can say that I have been impressed with Washington State and what the Liquor and Cannabis Board has been doing as they weigh in on lots of policies that are going to impact their department. And I know that their director of enforcement, as an example, will weigh in on those policies to say, this is going to increase burden on us, and I'm going to need X amount of additional resources to hire 5 more inspectors to oversee what this will create if you pursue expanding additional licenses or whatever the case might be. I don't know the specifics of every bill, but they use that. They've developed a matrices to analyze every policy that comes before them, that asks them to weigh in, so that they're weighing in on them fairly, the same, and also able to advocate for their agency for additional resources, again, as which is kind of the going trend to expand access and licensing, and that puts additional burden on that agency. So they have developed a tool for helping them do that, and I think that's a unique way to approach it. So again, if anybody knows more specific in Michigan, I couldn't speak to that, but I think that is a promising example of what can be done. Louise, are you there?
Yep, sorry. All right, well, thank you
That's okay.
so much, everybody. That was all of the questions there. But if people have additional questions, feel free to email Mike or myself, and we'll get those answered. Again, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at the Part 2 webinar.
Yes, thanks, Cassie.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
You're
Talk to you
welcome.
soon.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.